Our last unit is evolution, and in this unit we're covering parts of chapter 19, 21, and 22. I'm going to bounce back and forth a little bit between 19 and 21, so if you're looking for a particular topic, you may have to look through both chapters. Generally, I'm going to start in 21, go to 19, go back to 21, and go back to 19, and then finish up with 22. And this is because the topics overlap, and by doing that I end up not repeating things over and over, so it cuts down a little bit of time. So this whole unit is about evolution, and I like to start out by talking about what evolution is. Now we're going to talk about how evolution actually happens. We're going to talk about some of those specific mechanisms, but I find that with evolution, a lot of students come in with some ideas of what evolution is. Now, some students have learned about evolution before, others have not. Others have learned it from a non-biology perspective. And so I like to start out just kind of describing what evolution is and what it's actually addressing. So evolution in general, the definition is that it is a change in a population over time. More specifically, it's a change in the allele frequencies in a population. Now, this means that it is essentially a genetic change in a population. Now, we can look at it in terms of how a trait and its frequency is changing in a population, or we can look at it at the genetic level. Both are equally valid, as long as we're looking at change in the population. Evolution is a supported theory. And remember that a biological theory is something that has been supported over and over and over again. It's not a guess, it's not a hypothesis. Evolution happens to populations and not individuals. And this is one that I think students just confuse a little bit. So growth and development of an organism through its lifetime is not evolution. Evolution happens when a population as a whole has a shift. Evolution can produce new species, but it doesn't always. And I think that a lot of students have the idea that evolution happens over a long period of time and that it is always the production of new species. But evolution is not always making new species. It's simply a change in a population, and it might be a little change, it might be a large change. Evolution is not an explanation for creation, although you can go backwards from evolution to sort of get to creation. But evolution talks about change over time, not how things began. Evolution is not always a slow process. Evolution can happen in one generation. Of course, evolution does also happen over long time periods. So evolution is a central unifying theme in biology, and it is a unifying theme because evolution attempts to explain and connect the huge diversity of living organisms in our world. Evolution is a process that explains how these organisms are connected, how they are similar, and how they are different. And it attempts to explain why they are different, the mechanism for how organisms that are seemingly related to one another also have specific, very unique characteristics or adaptations for their environment. Now keep in mind that evolution is a theory, and in science, a theory is a broad explanation of something. Now this is a broad explanation that has been supported over and over by a variety of observations and experiments. Now we don't call them facts, but that would be the best synonym, I would say, for a theory. It's not something that has been proven unequivocally, but it is something that continues to be supported, and at any time it could be disproven or unsupported. But something becomes a theory when it is tested over and over and over and continues to be supported by new observations and new tests. So if we're talking about evolution at the population level, we need to define what a population is. A population is a group of individuals of the same species that are interbreeding in a specific area. Now, as researchers, we can define what that area and what that population is. So for example, on the image here, we have two different caribou herds that live up along the Alaska-Canada border. And our map here shows that there are two herds with overlapping ranges. So we could define our population as just the porcupine herd, that northernmost herd outlined in the pink there. Or we could define it as the 40-mile herd, the southern one outlined in the green. Now, what we're using for our definition of who is involved in the population depends on what we're looking at. But if we want to compare these two, then we need to define which organisms go in which population. And so as long as we're talking about individuals that can interbreed and live in the same area, we can define our population that way. So evolution happens when two conditions are met. The first is that some individuals survive and others do not. Now we'll talk about different ways that this can happen. There's not just one way that an individual can survive and others do not. But evolution requires that some live and pass on their genes and others die and don't pass on their genes, or survive for a short time without passing on those genes. The next requirement for evolution is that there must be variation in the population. And this is important because without variation, you can't have a change in frequency. So for example, if everyone in that porcupine herd has a specific color pattern that's exactly the same, if there's nothing new or different to change in frequency, no matter how many live or how many die, they're all going to have that particular pattern. But if some individuals have a different pattern that, say, make them a little more camouflaged in the grass, well then maybe those guys are going to survive and pass on their genes more frequently. So if we are going to have evolution happen, we must have variation. We must have one trait versus another. There can be more than two traits, but we have to have at least two traits, because keep in mind that we're talking about evolution as a change in frequency. If everyone's the same, there's no change in frequency. Also keep in mind that if we're talking about populations, that individuals who change throughout their lifetime are not evolving. So any traits that are acquired throughout a lifetime are not necessarily being passed on and are not the traits that evolution is working on. So for example, if a deer, or I'm sorry, we're talking about caribou. If a caribou is skinny because there's not enough grass that year, that trait's not necessarily going to be passed on to its offspring. That's an acquired characteristic. So we're only talking about variation that is at the genetic level that happens to the population. We talked about several different sources of variation throughout the semester already. The first time we talked about it was in chapter 10. We talked about sexual reproduction, and we spent a lot of time talking about how variation happens in meiosis. We talked about crossing over and independent assortment and how that makes new combinations of alleles. And then we talked about how variation also arises when you have unrelated individuals combining their gametes. And so of course you then get even more new combinations there. You can also get mutations that produce genetic variation. This might come in the form of new alleles, or it might come in the form of one allele changing into another. Those are both ways that you can produce variation in your population. And we spent a decent amount of time in chapter 14 talking about how mutations affect proteins and therefore affect phenotype. And then in chapter 14, we also mentioned very briefly how changing the physical makeup of a chromosome can also change or cause variation in a population, and that was altering our gene number or position through deletion, duplication, etc. So, evolution of populations. Evolution is a change in the allele frequency of a population over time. So we're going to talk about some of the mechanisms by which those allele frequencies are actually changed. So there are a variety of mechanisms that act on a population that can all cause allele frequencies to change. Some are directed and some are random events, but no matter what we're talking about, no matter what reason evolution occurs for, they are all forces that are happening outside of the control of individuals. So some individuals survive while others die, and it is an outside force that is causing those individuals to die. It is an outside force that is causing the allele frequencies in that population to change. So there are 4 causes for evolution. The main cause, and probably the most common cause for evolution, is natural selection. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about natural selection, and it is probably the process that if you have taken evolution before or learned anything about evolution, it's probably the concept that you are most familiar with. Mutation can also cause evolution. Gene flow or migration or emigration can cause evolution, and genetic drift, which is chance events, can also cause evolution to occur. So we're going to jump back over to chapter 19 just for a minute and talk about Charles Darwin and his ideas of descent with modification and natural selection. So Charles Darwin was a British explorer. He actually started out going to medical school and decided that really wasn't for him. And so he was able to find employment as a naturalist on a ship called the HMS Beagle. And his job on this ship was to basically come along and take notes and categorize living organisms, and he thought this would just be absolutely fabulous. So he got on this ship and he traveled from England around the southern half of the planet, and he spent a lot of time on the coast of South America. And the HMS Beagle was actually doing some mapping work, and so they were mapping the coastline, and part of his job was to map the coastline, but also to take notes on the flora and fauna that they found there. So Darwin's travels to South America were a huge influence on him, and all of his observations of the unique organisms that he saw and the trends that he began to notice about these organisms and where they were located compared to mainland South America all influenced his theory of evolution. And Charles Darwin began to want to explain the cause of all this diversity of all of the organisms that we have on Earth. So he spent a lot of time making notes and collecting specimens in the Galapagos Islands. So the Galapagos Islands are located off the coast of South America, and it's a chain of small islands there. And he took notes about a lot of organisms. The most famous ones that you are probably familiar with are Darwin's finches, and these are birds that are all similar from a common ancestor but have very unique beak shapes. And so he used examples like this where he was able to observe a wide variety of individuals to begin to formulate his ideas for the theory of evolution. So before Charles Darwin, the prevailing idea was that all organisms on Earth were created and they had remained unchanged since creation. Now, this is generally a biblical idea of creation. And to go along with that, with the biblical age of the Earth was set at only about 4,000 years old. So the idea was that Earth was made, all of the organisms were made, and everything remained unchanged, and that Earth was only a few thousand years old. Well, Darwin began to notice that, along with some other scientists at the time, that individuals change very slowly. And so, along with some theories by geologists that were working at the same time as him, he began to think that maybe the Earth must have been older than everyone thought, and if it was, it would provide time for organisms to change. So in 1859, Darwin wrote a short paper called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. And there was another scientist at the time, Alfred Russel Wallace. He was working in the Philippines and Indonesia, basically the Malay Peninsula. And he had also formulated a similar idea. And he wanted to publish publish his ideas as well. Now, Wallace and Darwin had been in correspondence. They knew what each of them was doing. And so Darwin published a short paper, even though he had been working on a really long book. And in this short paper, published alongside with Alfred Russel Wallace's work, Darwin proposed the idea of descent with modification. And he proposed that this descent with modification and the process of natural selection was able to explain why living organisms were so diverse on our planet. So descent with modification says that closely related species are similar because they share a common ancestor. So two organisms might look and act similar because of a common ancestor that passed down characteristics to both of them. But since that common ancestor, those species were modified by the unique pressures in their environment to accumulate adaptations that were specific for where they were living. So descent with modification explains both why some organisms are similar, why there is unity and similar traits and similar structures that are passed on through a wide variety of organisms, but also why those organisms, even though they have similar traits, look unique. And even though organisms in the same area, the same general region, might be unique because they are in specific environments. So down here on the left, we have what we now call a phylogenetic tree. And this was a sketch that Darwin did. Each of these nodes here shows a common ancestor. So he's proposing here that he thinks there's common ancestors here that lead to a variety of different organisms. And just here in the middle, we have a new version of a phylogenetic tree that shows how these are elephants and manatees, how they are related. And if you look at them, you'll notice that all of these elephant-like species are all similar. They have some traits that you would recognize as elephant-like, and that's because those traits were present in a common ancestor. But each one is a little bit different, and that's because they faced their own unique environments that shaped the actual physical characteristics that they have. So Darwin proposed that this idea of descent with modification occurs by the process of natural selection. So natural selection is one of our mechanisms of evolution. It is one of the causes of evolution. So natural selection is a process in which individuals with specific inherited traits survive and reproduce at higher rates than other individuals in their population because of those certain inherited traits. So what we have here is that some individuals have traits that allow them to survive better in their environment. And because they're surviving better, because they're thriving compared to others, they are going to reproduce more frequently. They're going to have more offspring, and therefore those advantageous traits are going to accumulate in that population. So there are a couple of requirements for natural selection to take place. One is that that trait has a genetic basis. So in other words, it is a trait that is encoded in the DNA. There must be variation in a population. Now that's a general requirement for evolution, but we also have variable reproductive success. Now this just means that in order for natural selection to occur, some individuals have to leave more offspring. Now this sounds really similar to the requirements that I just gave you a few slides ago for evolution. Please do not mix up natural selection and evolution. Evolution is any change in a population. Natural selection is a change that causes certain traits to increase in frequency because the individuals with those traits are reproducing more frequently. So natural selection is, in a sense, a directional process of evolution. Populations will change towards the trait, the higher frequency of the trait that is producing this survival and reproduction advantage. So the most important part of natural selection is that there is differential reproductive success. And that means that some traits are better than others at allowing individuals to survive and reproduce. So with natural selection as a mechanism for evolution, those advantageous traits are being passed on and therefore accumulating in the population. Now, as natural selection continues to occur, natural selection leads to adaptation. Now, this definition is going to sound really, really similar, but adaptations are the specific characteristics that enhance survival in a particular environment. So natural selection causes those characteristics to increase, but the actual characteristics are called adaptations. And it is those adaptations that make organisms unique. So the adaptations are the modification part of descent with modification. So as natural selection occurs, as specific traits begin to accumulate, you end up with organisms that become more fit to their environment. They match their environment better. And as adaptations begin to accumulate in a population, as organisms in certain areas are accumulating different adaptations than others, you start to see new species arise. Because as those adaptations in specific environments make those groups more and more different, they become less likely to interbreed, less likely to be part of the same population.